Welcome into the Inside Carolina podcast. This is a position preview podcast. Today we're going to break down the defensive line. I'm your host, Ross Martin, joined by Greg Barnes and Jason Staples. We're moving to the defense now. Offensive line's in the books, and we're moving on to the defensive line, a group of players that, just like the offensive line, the depth is there, the experience is there, and it's a group that needs to take a huge step entering the 2021 season. I think to make the difference in this team is going to start in the defensive line, of course, the whole defense, but I think they have the biggest room of growth from 2020 to 21. Let's get right into it. I'm going to run down the depth chart from what I think is the depth chart from what we've seen in the spring and from talking to sources. We won't mention every player, but this is who I think will play each position. Remember, UNC runs a 3-4 most of the time with an end, a nose, and a tackle. At end, you have Myles Murphy in his second year, stepped up in the spring and is right there at end. Right behind him, or kind of alongside him, is Tamari Fox, who started last year but missed the spring. Those guys are pretty interchangeable there at the first spot. And then behind them is true freshman Jahvaree Ritzie, who the staff absolutely loves, and you can kind of see the talent, physicality that Ritzie has. At nose, you have Ray Vohasek, a starter from last year. Behind him, Jaleel Taylor and Clyde Pender, who's in his second year at UNC now. And at tackle, you have Kevin Hester, who played a good amount last year. You have Myles Murphy, also who can play tackle. Christian Varner and Keyshawn Silver, a true freshman. And Varner hasn't played a lot, but he's a big body that the staff thinks has potential to contribute in 2021. Greg, we'll go to you first. What do you like about this group? What do you see from this group? What do you see from them in 20? And what do you see from them in the spring and looking ahead to 21, UNC's defensive line?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that, as we've talked about in the spring, I mean, Jay Bateman has 10 bodies that weigh 285 pounds or more, and that's something he has not had. That is a luxury. And when you talk about running a kind of a base 3-4, that's what you got to have. And you've got to have size up front if you want to do some of the things that he wants to do. And uh, last year, as an example, Tamon Fox played a lot at on the defensive line. And when you've got a guy of his size, who's he's more built like a defensive end, um, you're kind of lacking a little bit there. So I think the fact that they actually have size, that's going to free up Fox and Kamon Rucker to work on the edge a little bit more, which I think is a benefit for them. It's a benefit for the team. Kind of speaks to what they have up front. And when you look at this group, I mean, it just screams youth and talent. Myles Murphy, I thought, really came on strong last year. Clyde Pender, of course, was hurt, but when he came in late, I mean, I think that's the guy that has a lot of potential as a run stopper. I know they like what he can do as a pass rusher as well at the nose position. Tamari Fox has played a lot. Rafa Hasek has played a lot. Jaleel Taylor has played a lot. But then you start talking about guys like, as you said, Kevin Hester, who really showed out in spring, Christian Varner, and then you mentioned guys like Ritzie and Silver. And Silver was hurt a lot in the spring, so we didn't get to see quite as much of him. But those guys are just a ton of talent. And so you can lean on the older guys a little bit early, let the younger guys come along, and I think they're all going to play a lot. And so I think this is a year where this group is going to determine how good this team can be, kind of like you said. But I think there's the opportunity for this group to make significant strides, both because of the influx of talent and because they finally have the number of bodies that they need to do what Jay Bateman wants to do.
Yeah, let me go through some more notes here. And you're right, it is still young. Like, they still have a lot of, like, some of their starters are second-year players, third-year players. I mean, you can see Fox got pushed around a little bit last year. Everyone's going to be a little bit stronger. Vahasek is a starter. He's kind of the veteran in the room. So there is a lot of talent, but there is still a lot of youth. I think it's important to note. 9 guys can play, as well as been told. The depth is so much different than the last 2 seasons. Myles Murphy has established himself. He's a guy who can cause problems, I was told. Ray Vohasek had a great spring. He's apparently a top 5, top 6 defensive tackle in the ACC. They love what Kevin Hester has become. He's that giant body that they would have died for the last 2 seasons. Just didn't have a guy with that kind of size. They love the freshman. Ritzie's ahead of Silver. Both will play. Ritzie will play a little bit more. Those guys are free. I mean, Richie's a freak. They love what he can do. They said he could play. A source I talked to said he could play outside linebacker. That's how athletic he is. At 285, I'm not really sure of his size. Varner's 295. He's gonna play 10 to 15 reps a game. So kind of your reserve there. Tamari looks great. He's healthy, good to go. He'll be a full participant in all summer workouts, and definitely put on the right weight and has lost weight, or put on the right weight and looks great physically. And they love Murphy. He can play all over, and they like the fact of his versatility. He has the same weight as he was as a freshman, but he's lifting twice the amount in terms of bench and squat. So he's super strong now. And that's about it. Jason, when you hear all that, when you hear what Greg said, and you look at this group, what are your initial thoughts and your takeaways from the?
One of the things that stands out to me is that it's going to be really, well, there are a couple things that stand out, but the first thing is it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these younger guys, how long before they really push some of the older guys who are actually good players for those additional reps. So you look at a guy like Ritzy, there were a few things that I saw from him in the spring game that there hasn't been anybody at UNC the past 3 or 4 years that's been able to do that. Now, there were things that he did where it's like, oh, come on. Like, what, he's going to have to figure out this is college. He's going to, there are certain things with both him and Silver, you could see that they were still adjusting to the level of intensity and the expectations that you have to have play at the college game. And certain things in terms of being, perfectly gap disciplined or having your technique right here. But there were a few times where Ritzy in particular, you saw him get his hands on a guy, move that guy, get through a gap with quickness and go, oh, wow. Yeah, that's been missing. And that's despite the fact that I think, Hester and Murphy in particular have a lot to offer. I mean, those guys did stuff last year that they hadn't had anybody do for a couple of years either. So the talent upgrade is so big, and it's just going to be interesting to see how long it takes before some of those younger guys actually start basically knocking on the back of the older guys and getting them out of there essentially by being that much better, that much more productive. I think they're probably a year away from really those guys being at that level, but you're going to start to see indications of it at times. The second thing is, I think they're going to be able to platoon some this year in terms of knowing that playing down and distance type stuff. So against teams that are not going, hurry up, no huddle, warp speed all the time, when you're able to substitute, well, this is a passing down. We want to get our 3 best pass rushers at those spots on the field. They're going to be able to do that. So you're going to see, say, Tomari Fox, Clyde Pinder, and I don't know, maybe a Christian Varner all on the field together as your pass rush package that's going to give you more than what you've had in the past in terms of guys that can get to the quarterback from those spots. And then when it's, say, 2nd and 4, maybe you run 1 or 2 more of the beefier guys out there for some of those roles. So I think you're going to see more substitution situationally this year than what we've seen in a while, just as they're trying to get guys to maximize what they bring to the table as pass rushers, as run stoppers, as whatever. Now a guy like Murphy, he's going to be on the field a bunch anyway because he can kind of do it all. But I'm really interested to see how they platoon that. And I think there's one other guy that's not on the depth chart right now that is a guy to keep an eye on, and that's Kedrick Bingley Jones, who is a guy, he needs to be in better shape. You could see that after the injury in the spring. You could see that he was a ways away from the shape that he needs to be in, but with the right kind of off season, getting into the shape that he needs to be, he's a guy that at that nose position especially could really become a problem for teams inside. And so, it's really up to him. I mean, how dedicated is he going to be to being in the kind of shape and getting to the kind of physicality that he wants going in to potentially push all of those guys. So, I mean, cause he could be second, even first on the depth chart pretty quickly, given his talent. It's just a matter of how much does he want it and how quickly can he get to that level of shape.
Yeah, that's a guy that I wasn't even thinking about because he does need to lose a lot of weight, but he is another body. He was the high strength kid in that class for the defensive line. Great point about the platooning. I mean, I think the goal here is you want to make sure Vahasik is rested in the fourth quarter. So he's only getting maybe 40, 50 snaps total. And that's with that depth. I mean, these guys are going so hard on every snap. You definitely want to rest them. And I think they have the depth to do that. So that's important. Because I remember last year, like you have Tamari and Vahasik, and then have two of the outside linebackers on the outside because they only really had two guys they really trusted. And they finally got Murphy and Pinder and some other guys to have some reps and trust them. And so this year, while it's still young, I think they do have the depth. Greg, your opinion on kind of what you see from this group and the depth and the platooning and how you see is kind of breaking down throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, just looking back at the Notre Dame game, since that was such a big game for UNC last year. I mean, Tamari Fox and Raymond Vahasik are playing 47 of 70 snaps. And that's a lot. I mean, that's not having to play every snap like Jason Strowbridge and Aaron Crawford had to do several years ago. But that's still a lot of snaps. And when you're looking at,
and they had Tamon had to play on the line against Notre Dame. Correct. Bateman said that, I think, in one of our podcasts with him, that they had to move him to a D-line position, which was out of his wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I think that's the key component here, because I know we're talking specifically about defensive line, but when you're having to play, I mean, and Rucker was the same way. When you're having to play Rucker and Fox on the defensive line, well, that takes away some of your options at outside linebacker. And where did North Carolina struggle the most last year? Pass rushing. And I mean, that was the goal of the spring. And so when you can take a guy like Rucker and you can take a guy like Tamon Fox, who has so many sacks in his career, and allow them to play on the edge outside of the tackle, well, I mean, that helps you all the way around. And so that's one of the things with being able to put in some guys that they trust on the defensive line. You can make your team better by allowing Fox to play at a different position. Now, does that mean Fox is never going to play on the defensive line? No, of course not. There's going to be packages, kind of to Jason's point, where you want Fox in there. I mean, you may see Fox and Rucker on the defensive line at the same time, maybe alongside of Vahasik or Murphy, if it's an obvious passing down and they feel like they can get pressure that way. So the versatility there is important. But just having bodies where you feel comfortable in saying, we're going to stop the run. Because it doesn't matter what defensive coordinator there is, they're always going to tell you, we have to be able to stop the run. We have to be able to control it. We can scheme up anything we want, but if we can't do that, I mean, we're using smoke and mirrors to try to have success. And so with these bodies that they have up front, especially if they have 9 guys that they can actually play, I mean, even if half of those guys are like legitimate options, now you're going to have the opportunity to put a line out there that you feel comfortable in. Then you can be able to fire into some gaps and make sure you get some critical stops, because this all comes back to getting TFLs, right? And that's what Jay Bateman wants to do. And if you can get some TFLs and make somebody play behind the chains, now you're working with kind of what he wants to do. And that's kind of the key component. But as we've talked about time and time again, I know we say it ad nauseum, you got to have success up front. And this is the first time they actually have the bodies to be able to do that.
It's crazy thinking back of what they did last year with only like 2 or 3 guys that could really run out there. And then before that with just Crawford and Strowbridge, it's kind of night and day to how they were recruiting. And I think next year they'll even be better, because I think they could keep everybody and they could lose Vahasik if he wants to jump to the NFL. We're going to get back into it, guys. I want to talk to you about Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com, our loyal and dedicated podcast sponsor, right on Franklin Street and online at JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Get everything you need for the football games, for the basketball season, everything for tailgating, for gifts, for stuff for nieces, nephews, babies, sons, daughters, anything UNC related. Get it on JohnnyT-Shirt.com and right on Franklin Street. They're a local company. We always want to support local during these times. It's so important to support the people in your community. And that's Johnny T-Shirt. They've sponsored us for ever since I've been here at Inside Carolina. So they've been a great sponsor for our podcast. So help us by helping them. Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. And remember, all Inside Carolina subscribers can get 10% off their order with a discount code found on the Tar Pit and UNC basketball message boards. Just another perk you get along with all the great scoops and X's and O's stuff that Jason and Greg bring. Inside Carolina and JohnnyT-shirt.com. We'll be right back with more defensive line talk. And we're back with the Inside Carolina podcast, brought to you by Johnny T-shirt and JohnnyT-shirt.com. I'm your host, Ross Martin, joined by Greg Barnes and Jason Staples. And guys, we were talking in a commercial break. You know, I'd never played football. And so I've kind of, over my times covering UNC, I've kind of had to learn the different aspects, the nuances of offenses and defenses. And Jay Bateman's defense is still very confusing to me. You know, on the basic thing on the defensive line, he has an end, a nose, and a tackle, and those are the three defensive linemen that have a hand in the dirt. Jason, can you break down what he likes to do with those positions, the nuances of those roles in particular, the flexibility of them, and kind of explain to us and our listeners how Jay Bateman likes to use his defensive linemen position-wise?
So one of the things that makes it a little bit complicated is that he runs a very hybrid front. So it's not that he wants these guys to do one thing. So in some defenses, so for example, in Gene Chizik's defense, you had specific guys that they were going to do one thing. They're going to play one gap, and they're going to try to get penetration through that one gap, and it's always going to basically be that way. So you'd have, say, the nose tackle is going to be in the one gap. And again, just as a refresher for those of you who are not familiar with this terminology, defensive alignment for the defensive line runs on a number system. So you remember that you have on the offensive line, you might have the A gap, which is the gap between the center and the guard. You have the B gap between the guard and the tackle, and the C gap between the C gap between the tackle and the tight end or whoever's out there. On defense, though, there's a lot of different places that you can line up relative to that. So there are actually numbers that cover each of those specific spots. So you could be in the A gap. If you're in the A gap, then you're in the one technique, essentially. So what that means is you are in the gap between, but you might be in a zero technique, which means you're in neither gap. You're over the nose of the center. Now you're centered up over him. And so what you normally have is odd numbers mean you're in a gap. Even numbers mean you're over the offensive lineman that you're across from. So if you're a nose tackle and you're a one technique, then generally speaking, what that's going to mean is you're trying to get penetration through the A gap that you're lined up in. And with a guy like Gene Chizik, his defensive line was predicated on you'd have one guy in the one gap, and then you'd have one guy in the other three gap. And there'd be a linebacker who would be responsible for the other one gap. So essentially, the guy that's in that one gap, the defensive lineman, the nose tackle that's in that one gap, is trying to occupy the center and also occupy the guard to some degree by being in that gap between them. And that's going to turn the center to some degree and keep that linebacker safe, keep that linebacker covered so that linebacker can hit the other A gap. That's the way that this is going to work. Bateman will do that sometimes. So sometimes you're going to have the nose tackle who's going to be in a one gap situation. Sometimes you're going to see other alignments, but as often as not, and especially once he has the personnel that he wants, he's going to default to a more odd front concept where you're going to have the 3 down situation like what you're going to see this year. So last year you had a lot of four lineman scenarios. This year you're going to see more of the 3 stuff than what you've seen in the past. But when you see that, what you're going to see a lot of is the zero technique, where you're going to see, say, Vohasek, who's going to be over the center, and his job is to just be on the nose of the center. And as soon as the center snaps the ball, just kick his tail. Take him as far into the backfield as you can, and you're responsible for the A gap on either side of the center. So now you're 2 gapping is what it's called. You're responsible for 2 gaps instead of 1, and you're just trying to kick that guy's tail and take him back to the quarterback or to the running back, whoever gets the ball.
But Hasek But he has
that
both
allows
gaps when he's on the center.
Yeah, so he's got both gaps. No, and the way that this technically works is that you have one primary gap that you cover sort of with the front side of your body, and then you're still responsible for the other gap, which is for the other side, which you kind of cover by, by pushing the guy into that gap, right?
Okay.
So you kind of cover that with the angle there. And then the linebacker is going to be responsible for cleaning up wherever that ends up spilling to. So it ends up being a little bit more of a read situation for the backer than, coming straight downhill into the gap. And then that kind of works its way out to the tackle and the end. And the tackle in this situation is usually going to be a slightly bigger body, a little bit closer to a true defensive tackle than the end position. But both the tackle and the end are pretty close to interchangeable in this system. Just has to do with where you line up, on strong side or weak side. And those guys, when they go odd front, are often going to be lined up in what you would call the 4-eye position. So they're lined up over the offensive tackle. And the 4, if you're in a 4 technique, again, that's an even number. So the 0 would be over the center, the 2 is directly over the guard, and the 4 is directly over the offensive tackle. What the 4-eye is you're on the 4, but you're on the inside eye of that guy. So you're not quite in the gap, but you're also not quite head up. You're just slightly to the inside. And what you're trying to do there is to take this where you're going to cover that B gap by being there just with your bulk, but you're also taking on that blocker with strength to force that guy to essentially have problems blocking you out of the C gap as well. And if you have a really good set of 3 down linemen in this system who have a lot of size and can play with violence, the idea is that you could theoretically cover 6 gaps with 3 guys. And that allows you then to let your linebackers run around a little bit more. And that allows you to add another guy or 2 to coverage without losing too much in the run game because you're covering that. Now, practically speaking, that takes some ridiculous dudes up front. So as often as not, and this is where Bateman's system can get complex, is he'll have 1 guy or 2 guys on his defensive front that are 2 gapping. So 1 guy in a 4-eye over here, who's going to 2 gap between the B gap and the C gap on the guy that he's over. And then you have the 0 technique, who's going to 2 gap in the 2 A gaps. And then you have another guy out here who's actually in a 1 gap scheme, and he's just released to get to the quarterback if it's a pass. And so he's just getting upfield. And so you might split the field where these guys are in 2 gap, these guys are in 1 gap, or this guy is in 2 gap, these 2 guys are in 1. And so now that adds some complexity when you're trying to figure out whose responsibility is what. And that also can complicate things for offensive linemen and for offensive coordinators trying to teach their guys, okay, when he's here, you want to make sure you're blocking him with this technique because it can change. So all of that is part and parcel of what Jay Bateman's trying to do up front. And it's at this level, it's going to be predicated on having the bodies, the size in particular, and the length to be able to cover those things while not losing on the quickness front. And he's just now getting the bodies on the roster that can do the things that he wants to do with the versatility level that he wants to do it, so that he can throw different things at the offensive front and cause problems just by scheme and also by having big bodies that they're going to have to try to move.
Yep.
Is the end and the tackle, are they both a 4-eye? Is that their role?
In some defenses,
Okay.
see, again, it's
varies,
it's not the same, right? It's not the same every time. So you might have a call where the nose is in a 0, the tackle is in a 4-eye, and then the end is in a 5
Outside the tackle?
Yep, outside the
Or-
tackle.
Yeah, okay.
Or the end might be in a 3, the tackle might be in a 4-eye, and the nose might be in a 1.
Okay,
So
it just changes.
It can change a little bit. And so depending on what the calls are, they can move that stuff around. And yeah, they're going to have certain defaults. And I think this year you're going to see a lot of 0 flanked by 2 4-eyes, just because you're going to be able to use your size that way and platoon with guys that aren't going to get as tired doing some of that stuff. So then if you have some success with that, you're going to have teams trying to run the ball. Basically the 4-eye is going to force teams to try to run the ball outside the tackle. That's your goal.
Yeah. Okay.
What you're wanting is, okay, you're not going to be able to run on our nose tackle, who's taking up your guard or your center and at least one guard. And then those 4 eyes are occupying those tackles and also occupying the guards. And it's just creating a big pile on the inside. And now you're going to have to run around that. And guess what? We've got backers that can fly that are going to get to the edge there. And you're going to have trouble because now we've occupied your 5 blockers with our 3 guys. We're going to have an extra guy out here as you're running on the outside to clean that up. That's kind of the ideal for what Bateman wants to do. Can we occupy your 5 blockers with our 3 guys? And now we've got 2 backers that are coming along. And if you run your quarterback, which gives you an extra blocker, essentially, we still have an extra guy for that, because now we've got one backer that's not accounted for by the offensive line and another backer that's not accounted for by the offensive line. And one can take the quarterback, one can take the back, and all as well. That's the goal. That's what they're trying to do here. And personnel wise, they're finally getting to where they should be able to do that against a lot of teams.
That makes us quickly, Greg. When Buck and I talked to Bateman in February, he said the goal is to have the 3 biggest human beings at those 3 spots, and that makes sense to kind of be able to occupy and go against 5 offensive linemen. Greg.
Yep. Great breakdown by Jason there, but couple key points. But number one, when you talk about when you hear Bateman talk about a nose and a tackle and an end, what that makes me think of is you've got 2 setups really that we saw some last year. You've got the 1 technique, which is going to be your nose. You got your 3 technique, which is going to be your tackle. And then, as Jason said, when you talk about maybe the 4 even out to the 5 is where you have the end. That's one alignment. The stock kind of base 3-4 that everybody knows from the NFL, of course, is what he's talking about with the 0 and the 2-4 eyes. And he's exactly right that the idea is that center or the nose tackle is going to take on the center, is going to handle both of those gaps. And when you've got your 2-4 eyes, and all the eye means is that they're just on the inside eye of that tackle, they're going to handle the B gaps. So as he said, you've got 6 gaps essentially covered there that you're really working on. And that frees up everything. And the pros can do it because they have elite talent. It's been an issue at the college level for a while, but when you look at who uses that 3-4, I mean, you're talking about Wisconsin, you're talking about LSU, you're talking about Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia. I'm sure Bama uses it some. What's unique about those teams? They recruit at the highest level, and they can bring in these big guys up front. That's where Mack Brown's wanting to go. Vic Koenning was not able to get those guys. Larry Fedora was not able to get those guys, enough of them. And so you kind of have to be creative. And that's what you see is a lot of these programs that can't recruit the lines at an elite level have to try to get creative. Well, if you can recruit big guys like Ritzy and Silver and all these other guys and maybe a Shaw, now all of a sudden you can do whatever you want to do. And if you're able to put 3 guys up front and they can take care of 5 offensive linemen, well, guess what you can do on the back end with those other 8? Anything you want to do and have success.
And that's why you see these linebackers they're recruiting just fast guys like Rod Dilworth who can clean up all that stuff edge to edge. And you're seeing a different type of player they're recruiting at linebacker as well. And the ends, the outside linebackers, edge rushers, which is the next podcast, which also have kind of a different role too, which we'll definitely talk about as well. You know, it's a big time recruit when Greg knows Travis Shaw, and I'm sure Jason's familiar. Where would he play, Jason? Would he be a nose? Because he plays edge in high school. They put him on the edge because they want to get him kind of far away from all the middle. He played a lot of edge in high school, but he's a 6'5", 330.
Yeah, he's kind of your ideal nose if you want to have him do the most damage. But at the same point, from what I've seen of him, you can kind of play him at all 3 of these spots, and that kind of makes him really unusual in that respect. Because in the same way that Bateman has said that Ritzy could play outside linebacker. Well, you're looking at a guy with Shaw who could play nose, he could play either end or tackle. And so depending on where you want him, you just have other guys on the field. And, maybe in a particular matchup or for a particular pass rush thing, you start to tinker with that by the time he's, sophomore and he's familiar with what you want to do. You say, well, second and long here, we want you on that guard, or we want you on that tackle because that guy can't handle it. And you start moving those guys around. And that's when it starts to get really fun as a coordinator, is when you've gotten past the, okay, we've got to just get it shored up to where we have guys that are competent at each spot, to I've got a mismatch here that I can move around a little bit. And now I can cause problems with this guy. And that's really where they're headed to, because Ritzy and Silver are going to be problems for teams very quickly. You add a kid like what they're potentially had with Shaw. Oh my goodness. And it is it's going to be really interesting to see how Bateman's able to use all that. I also think it's worth mentioning that we're not always going to see three bigs on the field. We're going to see it more this year than we did last year. But depending on down and distance, depending on situation, a lot of times you're just going to see, say, a nose and a tackle out there in order to have two edge guys. So then you're going to be in closer to an odd or to an even front where you have, a 1 and a 3, and then you have two pass rushers out there just to be able to cause problems in, say, 2nd and 11 and 3rd and 13. That's when you get your two outside linebackers with two interior guys, and you just let them eat.
And they got, Tamon Fox, Desmond Evans, Kamen Rucker. They love those guys. Chris Collins. They have a lot of depth and a lot of experience depth at outside linebacker. Greg, anything else to close?
No, I was just going to say, you talk about recruiting a guy like Shaw, and you talk about Ritzy and his athleticism. I think one of the things that stood out to people about how well Clemson had recruited up front was after they won the national championship, 4 years ago. And Christian Wilkins, who is a defensive tackle, is doing splits on the stage and bouncing back up.
Yeah.
That is freakish athleticism. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about guys like Shaw and Ritzy.
I was at a coaching clinic down at Clemson when Wilkins was there. And at the end of practice, he went back and was catching punts in their special teams period. He actually was catching punts with their punt returners. And at one point, the punt was kind of shanked by like a backup punter. And Wilkins catches this ball on a dead run. I mean, it was hit about 30 yards away from where he was lined up initially. He catches this ball on a dead run down below his waist in a catch that, quite frankly, I mean, I've caught a lot of punts in my day. That's not an easy catch for anybody, let alone a guy that's 310 pounds. But he catches it and then stops, or he catches it on the run, doesn't stop, but just makes a little like jitter move, stutter go, and then shouts at all the coaches who are watching along the sideline, "These hips don't lie." And everybody just lost it. And that's the kind of athlete that if you want to compete at the national championship level, you got to have those dudes. And that's special. When you got a guy that's 6'4", 310, catching a punt on a 30-yard dead sprint down between his waist and his knees, and then makes a little move and just for fun, and then shouts at everybody on the sideline, and he's that athletic, then you're going to be competing for championships. And those are the kinds of guys that they're starting to get on campus.
Yeah, I saw I was at UNC's camp on Saturday, and I saw Keyshawn Silver and Ritzy. And I mean, there's nobody at UNC's had since I've covered UNC that looks like that. They
look different.
I mean, they're impressive, and they're true freshmen. Keyshawn's massive. He probably might lose a little weight, and Ritzy looks unbelievable. And then Desmond Evans
off the bus first.
Desmond Evans is another guy we'll talk about in the next podcast. 6'6", 260. They love him, and I think he's gonna have a big year. All right, guys, that's it. If you stayed through all that stuff, I mean, the word gap was said about 50 times. If you stayed through all of Jason's stuff, we appreciate it. That was good. I learned a lot as well. Hope you did. Defensive line. UNC's defensive line is going to be a very critical part for the success of the 2021 team. We appreciate you listening to this position podcast. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and check out Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com.